Thank you, Chris. My name is Samantha Lyneham. I'm a Principal Research Analyst at the Australian Institute of Criminology, where I lead our program of research around human trafficking and modern slavery. So today I'm going to be taking you through the results of a study looking into the issue of labour exploitation facilitated by online dating platforms. This is a piece of research that I collaborated on with some of my colleagues at the Australian Institute of Criminology, Alexandra Giannoni, former research manager Dr. Hayley Boxall, as well as Dr. Nerida Chazal from the University of South Australia. And the reason we were interested in this topic is really because there is a small but growing body of international research that has shown that digital technologies, and particularly social media, have broadened the ability of human traffickers to profile, recruit, exploit and control victims, and that dating apps specifically are emerging as a place where victims have been recruited for sex and labour trafficking. For example, in the United States, the online dating platforms were the most commonly reported site of recruitment for victims of trafficking identified through the National Human Trafficking Hotline in 2021. And the emergence of this kind of trend of using dating platforms has sparked a range of international regulatory and law enforcement bodies, such as the European Commission and the FBI, to issue warnings to the community about traffickers who use social media to, and in particular dating platforms, to learn personal information about users and then employ targeted communication strategies to coerce them into exploitative conditions. At the same time, we all know that there's a growing concern around technology-facilitated abuse more broadly, including digital dating abuse, where dating apps are being used to perpetrate a range of abuses, stalking, harassment, coercion, control, and as we've been hearing about, particularly sexual abuse of victims. And this is prolific. It's estimated that about half of dating app users globally have experienced these types of harms from someone they've met on a dating app. In Australia, I'll just point out a couple of recent studies, one by Powell, Flynn and Hines, published in 2022, estimated that 1 in 2 Australians had experienced technology-facilitated abuse in their lifetime. And another study by my AIC colleagues, published in 2022 as well, found that almost 3 in 4 Australians had experienced online or in-person sexual abuse by someone they met on a dating app in the previous 5 years. What these studies also show is that it's women more than men who are likely to experience technology-facilitated abuse, but of course this varies by the type of abuse that's being perpetrated. But while there has been this growing evidence around technology-facilitated abuse and digital dating abuse as a common form of this, there really has been very little scrutiny of digital dating abuse resulting in the severe exploitation of people, and in particular non-sexual forms of exploitation. And so we saw a need for this research to be conducted to examine if and how dating apps are being used to recruit people into exploitation and to identify what the implications are for online safety. So what we did was conduct a survey in 2021. There were almost 10,000 respondents to that survey. The respondents were individuals living in Australia, aged 18 years or over, who had reported using a dating app in the previous 5 years. And this survey was representative of the Australian population. We asked respondents about 3 things in the survey. So the survey had 3 distinct sections to it. They were around forms of sexual violence, child sexual exploitation, and then finally what I'm talking about today is the severe exploitation of users. And we wanted to know 3 things. First was how prevalent labour exploitation is among dating platform users, what types of labour exploitation online dating platform users were experiencing, and what factors increase the risk of a dating platform user being exploited by someone they meet on a dating platform. We chose to focus on labour exploitation for a couple of reasons. First is that there has been a greater focus on technology being used to prevent and detect forms of human trafficking, but there's been much less examination of technology being used to enable human trafficking. Second, there's been a greater focus on sexual exploitation, and really not much has been said about forms of labour exploitation happening across social media and dating platforms. And finally, we chose to focus on labour exploitation and specifically exclude questions around sexual exploitation to ensure that respondents to the survey didn't conflate sexual exploitation with other forms of sexual violence that were being asked in the survey. So we wanted to ensure that labour exploitation was able to be distinguished from the other behaviours that they were being asked about, so we could examine the results independently and there wasn't that conflation and confusion about what it is that we were asking them about. So labour exploitation is this rather nebulous kind of concept. It's often used to describe a broad range of behaviours that constitute an abuse of a person's provision of work or service for profit. And it's generally thought that these behaviours can exist along a continuum of severity. So some of those behaviours exist at the really pointy end and constitute really serious crimes related to human trafficking and modern slavery, things like debt bondage and forced labour. And they generally involve, or they do involve, coercion, violence and human rights abuses. But in other instances, labour exploitation could really reflect, I guess, lesser crimes or even breaches of labour laws, so things relating to substandard work and unsafe working conditions, underpayment and overwork. And so we wanted to focus on the pointy end. So we looked at common indicators of severely exploitative working conditions, including forced labour, to inform the survey items. And because we were interested in forms of recruitment, coercion and exploitation, we wanted to understand the types of things that you're seeing on the screen here. So we wanted to firstly understand what offers or what opportunities were being presented to users. So we've heard earlier in this session that these types of interactions usually start with some kind of offer before they proceed to coercion. And specifically, based on the literature, we were interested in opportunities that were presented to dating app users around things like study, work, travel, the ability to obtain a visa or help to obtain a visa, and also obtaining illicit drugs. We then wanted to know the means by which they were coerced to provide labour or services, and there were two measures for this that we looked at. The first was the retention of identity documents, and the second was threats to the user or their loved ones if they didn't comply with demands that were being made by the person they met on the dating app. And finally, we wanted to look at the presence of indicators of severe labour exploitation, and again we used two measures. The first was around debt bondage. So, being owed money, having a debt imposed on a user, and being charged very high levels of interest for that debt, and also being forced to work for little or no pay by someone that they met on a dating app. And what we found is that almost half, so 45% of survey respondents, had contact with another dating app user who made them some type of offer related to study, work, travel, obtaining a visa or obtaining illicit drugs. And the most commonly reported type of offer that was being made by another dating app user was an offer to travel, either within Australia or overseas. Among respondents who were made some type of offer by someone they met on the dating app, about a third reported then being subjected to at least one form of labour exploitation. Out of the total sample of survey respondents, this equals 1 in 10 survey respondents. More specifically, 29% of respondents who were made one of these types of offers reported then experiencing indicators of debt bondage. 21% then reported being forced to work for little or no pay by the person that they met on the dating app. And 19% of respondents experienced both forms of labour exploitation, so indicators of debt bondage as well as being forced to work. The prevalence of these forms of labour exploitation varied by the type of offer that was made to respondents by the people that they met online. In particular, indicators of labour exploitation were highest among respondents who had been offered an opportunity to study, either in Australia or overseas, which ranged between 2/3 of respondents who reported being forced to work and 3/4 of respondents who reported experiencing debt bondage. And conversely, exploitation was lowest among respondents who had been offered a travel opportunity. So although travel was the most commonly received opportunity, it was the opportunity that resulted in the lowest instance of exploitation. We then looked at 2 indicators of coercion, so the retention of identity documents that the user was then unable to access, they didn't have control of them, and threats to the user or their loved ones. And we found very consistent results across both forms of exploitation. Of the respondents who said they were subjected to debt bondage, 3/4 had their identity documents withheld, and the same proportion experienced threats towards themselves or a loved one. Of the respondents who were forced to work for little or no pay, about 85% had their identity documents withheld or experienced threats towards them or their loved one. And almost 80% of respondents reported having both their identity documents withheld and also experiencing threats. We then looked at the characteristics of people who had indicators of labour exploitation, and we found that most commonly they identified as men. Internationally, most dating app users are men, and victims of forced labour are also most commonly men. But most victims of technology-facilitated abuse are women, and most victims identified in Australia of human trafficking and modern slavery of any form are also women. And so I thought these findings were really interesting because I think they indicate that there are potentially more men experiencing technology-facilitated abuse and exploitation in Australia than we perhaps realise. Most respondents were between 25 and 44 years of age, which again is consistent with the profile of both dating app users and those who are exploited. But I think what stands out from this research is that half of those who had indicators of labour exploitation were First Nations Australians. Just over half were living with a disability. Half held tertiary education qualifications, and the vast majority were Australian citizens or permanent residents. So we know that First Nations people and people living with a disability are at increased risk of technology-facilitated abuse. And as Siobhan pointed out in her earlier presentation, we're also seeing an increase in highly qualified and professional individuals who are responding to fake job adverts and then being coerced into exploitation. But most victims of modern slavery to date have been in Australia on a temporary visa, and this isn't reflected in this result. So these are Australians who are being exploited rather than migrants. The final stage of the analysis aimed to identify factors that were independently or cumulatively associated with the risk of being forced to work specifically. We removed indicators around debt bondage for the remaining analysis. That was a conscious decision because we felt that being forced to work for little or no pay was the strongest indicator of labour exploitation. We then estimated a logistic regression model to predict who would be most likely to be forced to work for little or no pay by someone they met on a dating app. Based on the type of offers that they received, the user socio-demographic characteristics, and then also how they used online dating platforms, so things like frequency of use. And what we found is that respondents who were offered a study opportunity were 120% more likely to be at risk of being forced to work for little or no pay than respondents who didn't receive a study offer, but received some other type of offer. So this is based on the subsample of respondents who had received some type of offer and then experienced exploitation. We also found that respondents who were offered visa sponsorship were 73% more likely to be forced to work, and those who were offered employment were 60% more likely to be forced to work. Further, we found that users who receive multiple offers are more likely to be exploited than those who receive a single offer. And so we then examined the interaction between different combinations of offers. And we found that in particular, users who are offered visa sponsorship in combination with another offer are most at risk. And if that offer is related to study, they are 91% more likely to experience exploitation than users who are only offered a study opportunity. And that if the user receives an offer for visa sponsorship as well as employment, then they're 83% more likely to experience exploitation than users who are only offered employment. We found that respondents' socio-demographic characteristics were also independently associated with risk of exploitation, and specifically respondents living with a disability were 32% more likely to experience exploitation. Respondents who had lower levels of education or were identified as First Nations Australians were about 20% more likely to experience exploitation. And then we also found that men were 10% more likely to experience exploitation. So again, once we hold some of those other factors constant, the risk for men, even though they experienced the highest sort of level of exploitation in the survey sample, as well as people with a higher level of education, once we held other factors constant in the regression analysis, that risk level actually reduced. We then looked at how respondents said they were using dating platforms, and we found that linking social media with your dating profile made users 47% more likely to be exploited. And so we've drawn some conclusions and possible implications from this study. And I think the first thing to note is that the findings contribute to existing evidence that dating apps are being used in unintended ways, including to facilitate online and in-person crimes, and that users are experiencing different types of exploitation than perhaps what we expect. So we've heard through this conference, and we know through prior research about the risks associated with sexual violence, also things like romance scams and other types of fraud. But this study really demonstrates that a concerning proportion of users, so 1 in 10 dating app users, may be approached by someone they meet on a dating app and subsequently coerced into exploitative conditions. The study also shows that being offered a study opportunity, either in Australia or overseas, by another user presents the greatest risk to labour exploitation. And this risk increases further if users receive multiple offers, especially if one of those additional offers is for visa sponsorship, so that the user can either stay in Australia or travel overseas. A limitation of the study is that we weren't able to determine whether users were receiving multiple offers from the same person at the same time, or if they were receiving multiple offers from different users that they were communicating with. But one hypothesis that we do have is that users might be offered packages to entice them into accepting these offers and then ending up in exploitative conditions. And so this could be, for example, a primary offer of employment and then the means of accepting that offer through travel or visa sponsorship. I also think there's some potential there's a potential education piece here to be done with students or potential students who use dating apps, and to warn them about users that they meet, making them these kind of offers and using dating platforms in unintended ways that not for dating, that kind of off-label use. I think there's also a warning message about linking social media with dating profiles, as those users are most likely to be exploited, and that's likely because information that is easily accessible via social media allows perpetrators to target individuals who may be vulnerable to exploitation, to tailor their interactions with them, to gain their trust, and then establish relationships that the victims believe are genuine. This study also shows that dating apps can provide perpetrators with effective means of targeting victims, developing relationships with them, and that dating apps really have streamlined recruitment strategies into labour exploitation. However, I do also think that the findings tend to correlate with what we know around victims of technology-facilitated violence, and less so with what we know about victims of human trafficking and modern slavery. And so we are potentially seeing a different demographic of trafficking victim emerge from this research. And so I think these findings do support the need for dating apps to embed those safety by design principles that we've been hearing about from e-safety, that proactively safeguard users, for tech companies to become involved in taking responsibility for safeguarding users. And many of them are doing some of that now, and they include things like accessible reporting mechanisms, multi-level identity verification, mutual agreement between users before communicating, and importantly, this research shows the option to de-link social media from dating platforms. Finally, due to the limitations of this study, I think there's still a need for research that examines the interactions between victims and perpetrators during the recruitment phase and their communications on dating apps and websites, and then what happens after that. Once they move off of the dating app or website, we don't really know what happens in terms of those interactions between victims and perpetrators to coerce them into exploitative conditions, or what those exploitative conditions are. So we need more research to understand the type of work, the industry, the working conditions, and who the perpetrators are. So that's it from me. Thank you for listening, and happy to take questions.